Marcus Thompson's coffee mug slipped from his weathered fingers, shattering against the porch steps as he stared at the impossible sight across the street. The German shepherd sat motionless before the abandoned garrison house like a bronze statue, its amber eyes locked on the boarded windows with an intensity that made Marcus's chest tighten. This wasn't just any stray dog. This was military precision, discipline carved into every rigid line of its battle-scarred frame. Eleanor Whitman's gardening shears clattered to the ground as she followed his gaze, her face draining of color. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand to her throat. That's impossible." The dog had been sitting there for 3 days straight, never moving, never eating, as if guarding secrets that had been buried with the Garrison family 3 years ago. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his service pistol against his ribs, a weight he hadn't carried since Linda's funeral. Fresh scratch marks gouged the Garrison house's front door, marks that definitely weren't there yesterday. What was that dog protecting? And why did Marcus feel like his own life depended on finding out? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marcus Thompson had never planned on becoming the kind of man who talked to dogs, but 6 months of living alone in Pinewood had changed a lot of things about him. At 62, the former Army mechanic carried himself with the careful posture of someone whose back had lifted too many engines and whose knees had crawled under too many Humvees in the scorching heat of Afghanistan. His short-cropped gray hair and weathered hands told the story of a working man, but it was his eyes, pale blue and often distant, that revealed the deeper wounds. The move to North Carolina had been Linda's idea, back when she was still fighting the cancer that would eventually win. "Find somewhere quiet, Marcus," she'd whispered during one of her final hospital stays. "Somewhere you can hear yourself think again." He'd chosen Pinewood because it was small, affordable, and far enough from Charlotte to keep the noise of the world at bay. What he hadn't expected was how the silence would amplify everything he'd been trying to forget. The modest ranch house on Maple Street came with a mortgage that stretched his disability pension thin, especially after Linda's medical bills. Most mornings, Marcus sat on his front porch with black coffee and watched his neighbors head off to jobs he'd never have again. There was comfort in the routine: the mail truck at 11:30, school buses at 3:15, and Eleanor Whitman tending her rose garden with the dedication of a woman who'd outlived 2 husbands and most of her friends. Eleanor had been his first and only real friend in Pinewood. At 75, she possessed the kind of southern warmth that came with homemade biscuits and unsolicited advice. She'd appeared at his door 3 days after the moving truck left, carrying a casserole and an endless supply of neighborhood gossip. "Honey," she'd said in her sweet drawl, "a man your age shouldn't be eating frozen dinners and talking to himself." The Garrison house sat directly across the street, a 2-story colonial that had once been painted cheerful yellow, but now wore the gray pallor of abandonment. Marcus had learned the story in pieces from Eleanor's careful revelations over evening sweet tea. Captain David Garrison, his wife Rebecca, and their 10-year-old son Tyler had simply vanished one August night 3 years ago. No forwarding address, no goodbye to neighbors, no explanation to the school district. "It was the strangest thing," Eleanor had told him, rocking slowly in her porch chair. One day Rebecca was borrowing sugar for Tyler's birthday cake, and the next morning their car was still in the driveway, but nobody answered the door. Police said it looked like they'd left in a hurry, beds unmade, dishes in the sink, Tyler's bicycle still in the yard. The official story was family emergency, sudden relocation, people moved on. But 3 years later, the house remained frozen in time, owned by some distant property management company that paid the taxes and ignored the decay. Neighbors had long since stopped wondering about the Garrisons, accepting their disappearance as one of those mysteries that small towns eventually forget. Until now, when a battle-scarred German shepherd had returned to stand vigil. The fourth morning brought rain, but the German shepherd remained at his post. Marcus watched from behind his kitchen curtains as water dripped from the dog's thick coat, forming small puddles around his motionless form. There was something heartbreaking about the animal's dedication, something that reminded Marcus of soldiers he'd known who died at their posts rather than abandon their duty. "That's not natural," Eleanor said, appearing at Marcus's elbow with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She'd taken to letting herself in through the back door, a liberty that Marcus found oddly comforting. "Dogs don't sit still like that unless they're trained to. Military trained." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that Eleanor somehow made better than his own attempts. "You think he belonged to the Garrisons?" "I know he did." Eleanor's voice carried a weight that made Marcus look at her sharply. "That's Ranger, David Garrison's K9 partner from Iraq. I saw David working with him in the backyard plenty of times before." She trailed off, her weathered fingers tightening around her mug. "Before what, Eleanor?" "Before they disappeared. That dog was David's shadow, went everywhere with him, protective as a mama bear with her cubs." She paused, watching the rain streak down the window. "The night the family vanished, I heard barking. Terrible, frantic barking that went on for hours. By morning it had stopped, and I figured they'd taken Ranger with them." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "But he's here now. Been here for 3 years, honey. I've been feeding him when I could, leaving scraps by the back fence. He won't come close, won't let anyone touch him. But he won't leave either." Eleanor's eyes filled with unshed tears. "That poor creature has been waiting for his family to come home." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd spent enough time with military working dogs to understand their loyalty, their unbreakable bonds with their handlers. The idea that Ranger had been keeping vigil for 3 years, waiting for a family that might never return, was almost unbearable. That afternoon, Marcus walked across the street with a bowl of fresh water and a plate of leftover pot roast Eleanor had brought over. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture and the promise of more storms. Ranger watched his approach with intelligent amber eyes, but didn't move from his position in front of the porch steps. "Hey there, boy," Marcus said softly, setting the food and water within reach but not too close. "I know you're waiting for David. I understand duty, believe me." Ranger's ears twitched at the mention of David's name, but he made no move toward the offerings. Marcus settled himself on the wet grass, keeping a respectful distance, and began to talk. He told Ranger about Afghanistan, about the dogs he'd worked with, about the loyalty that transcended species and circumstances. The German shepherd listened with the focused attention of a soldier receiving orders. It was while sitting there watching Ranger's stoic vigil that Marcus noticed the collar buried in the overgrown flower bed. The leather was weathered and partially hidden by weeds, but when he carefully extracted it, his hands began to shake. The metal nameplate was tarnished but readable. Ranger, U.S. Army, K9, if found contact CPT, D, Garrison. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, examining the collar more closely. There were scratches on the leather, what looked like teeth marks, and dark stains that could have been blood. This wasn't a collar that had simply been lost or discarded. It had been torn off, possibly during a struggle. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, the collar placed carefully beside him like evidence. His search for Captain David Garrison, U.S. Army, yielded service records, deployment information, and commendations for his work with military working dogs. David Garrison had been a decorated soldier, a specialist in explosive detection and combat operations. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq with Ranger, earning both of them recognition for saving countless lives. The adoption records were harder to find, but Marcus's persistence paid off. When David retired from active duty, he'd officially adopted Ranger through a military working dog retirement program. The paperwork showed Ranger's medical history, combat injuries including shrapnel wounds and hearing damage that had led to his retirement. The dog had given his youth and health to his country, just like his handler. But something didn't add up. If the Garrison family had left voluntarily, why would they abandon Ranger? And why was the dog's collar buried in their front garden like a grave marker? Marcus looked up from his laptop to find Eleanor standing in his doorway, her face pale in the porch light. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk. There are things about that night, things I never told the police because Frank made me promise to keep quiet." Her hands trembled as she clutched her sweater tighter. "But Frank's been dead 2 years now, and I can't carry these secrets anymore." Eleanor's confession came in broken fragments like pieces of a shattered mirror that cut as she handled them. They sat in Marcus's living room, the lamp casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of 3-year-old secrets. "Frank and I were watching television that night," Eleanor began, her voice barely audible. "It was around 11 o'clock when we heard the screaming. Not human screaming, Ranger's barking, but desperate, like he was in pain. Frank wanted to go check, but then we heard the other sounds." Marcus leaned forward, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "What kind of sounds?" "Shouting, men's voices, but not David's. Someone was giving orders, military-style commands. Frank recognized it from his Navy days." Eleanor's fingers worried at the hem of her sweater. "Then there were these horrible thuds, like something heavy being dragged across the porch." The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "We should have called 911 right then, but Frank was scared, said it sounded like government business, the kind of thing civilians shouldn't get mixed up in. He'd seen enough in the service to know when to keep his head down." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, not at Eleanor, but at the circumstances that had silenced potential witnesses. "What happened next?" The barking stopped suddenly. Just stopped, like someone had hurt Ranger badly enough to shut him up. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Then we heard vehicles starting up, more than one. Big engines, like trucks or vans. They drove away without headlights. Frank noticed that because he was peeking through the curtains." The pieces were falling into a horrifying pattern. Marcus set down his coffee cup, his hands steady despite the rage building inside him. "You saw Ranger after that night?" "Not right away. 3 days later, I found him collapsed behind our shed, barely breathing. He was torn up something awful, bite marks, cuts like he'd been in a terrible fight. I wanted to take him to the vet, but Frank wouldn't let me. Said if we got involved, we might end up like the Garrisons." Eleanor's voice broke completely. "I've been feeding that poor creature scraps for 3 years, Marcus. 3 years of watching him wait for a family that might be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus stood up, pacing to the window where he could see Ranger's silhouette in the darkness across the street. The dog hadn't moved from his post, even as night fell. "Eleanor, I need you to think carefully. Did you recognize any of the voices that night?" "There was one that sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it at the time." She hesitated, then looked directly at Marcus. "It was only later, when that nice Colonel Patterson started coming around asking about the family, that I realized where I'd heard that voice before." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Colonel Patterson?" "Bill Patterson. He showed up about a week after the family disappeared, said he was a family friend, concerned about their welfare. Such a polite man, very military-bearing. He asked the same questions the police did, but he seemed more thorough. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. He's been back several times over the years, always checking to see if anyone had heard from the Garrisons. Always very interested in what the neighbors might have seen or heard that night. Marcus felt the familiar weight of combat intuition settling in his gut. The same instinct that had kept him alive in Afghanistan was now screaming warnings. Eleanor, I need you to stay away from Patterson if he comes around again. Don't talk to him. Don't answer your door. Can you do that for me? You think he's dangerous? I think he's the reason David Garrison's dog has been keeping vigil for 3 years. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his earlier research. I'm going to find out who Colonel Bill Patterson really is. The search results were immediately suspicious. Patterson's military record was heavily redacted, marked with classifications that suggested black operations or intelligence work. What Marcus could access showed a career built in the shadows, special operations, overseas deployments to places that officially didn't exist, and a service record that ended abruptly 5 years ago with an early retirement. But it was the personal information that made Marcus's blood run cold. Patterson's son, Second Lieutenant Michael Patterson, had been killed in action in Iraq in 2009, the same year and theater where Captain David Garrison and Ranger had been deployed. Marcus's laptop screen glowed as he dug deeper, cross-referencing deployment records and casualty reports. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered across classified databases and redacted documents, but the pattern was emerging. Patterson and Garrison had served in the same area of operations. Michael Patterson had died in an incident involving an IED, the exact type of explosive device that Garrison and Ranger specialized in detecting. The timeline was damning. Michael Patterson died in March 2009. David Garrison received a disciplinary action the same month for failure to follow proper protocols. Patterson retired from active duty within the year, relocating to North Carolina shortly afterward. "Son of a bitch," Marcus whispered, the full scope of Patterson's revenge becoming clear. A soft knock at the front door interrupted his research. Marcus glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Through the peephole, he saw a tall figure in military dress, standing at perfect attention despite the late hour. Colonel Bill Patterson smiled pleasantly when Marcus opened the door, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who'd found his prey. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," Patterson said in a voice that was honey over steel. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your interest in the Garrison family. And that dog." Patterson stepped into Marcus's living room with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was tall and lean, with silver hair cut in a precise military fade and the kind of bearing that marked career officers. His civilian clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt couldn't disguise the predatory grace in his movements or the way his eyes catalogued every detail of Marcus's home. "Nice place," Patterson said, settling into Marcus's recliner without invitation. "Reminds me of my own setup when I first retired. Takes time to adjust to civilian life, doesn't it? All that quiet after years of purpose." Marcus remained standing, positioning himself between Patterson and the kitchen where he kept his service weapon. "What do you want, Colonel?" "Please, call me Bill. We're both veterans here, no need for formality." Patterson's smile was practiced, the kind that had probably charmed superior officers and intimidated subordinates for decades. "I understand you've been asking questions about the Garrison family. As someone who cared deeply about David, I thought I should clarify a few things." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that David Garrison was a broken man long before he left Pinewood." Patterson's voice carried a note of manufactured sympathy. PTSD, financial troubles, marriage problems, the kind of issues that drive good soldiers to make desperate choices. Marcus felt the familiar tingle of danger that had kept him alive through 2 deployments. Patterson's words were too smooth, too prepared. Funny how a man making desperate choices would leave his dog behind. Patterson's smile faltered for just a moment, a crack in the facade that revealed something cold and calculating underneath. Dogs are resilient creatures. They adapt. Unlike their owners, who sometimes can't handle the weight of their failures. What failures would those be? Iraq. March 2009. An IED that should have been detected. Patterson's voice hardened, losing its false warmth. My son Michael was walking point that day, 22 years old, full of promise and patriotic duty. The kind of young man who believed in his training, trusted his equipment, relied on specialists like Captain Garrison to keep him safe. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place, but kept his expression neutral. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? Patterson stood up, his movement fluid and threatening. Because sorry doesn't bring back a son, Mr. Thompson. Sorry doesn't explain why a decorated K-9 team failed to detect an explosive device that killed 3 American soldiers and wounded 7 others. Combat operations involve risks, you know that. This wasn't risk. This was negligence. Patterson began pacing, his control slipping with each word. Garrison's report claimed equipment malfunction, adverse weather conditions, intelligence failures. Everything except the truth. Which was? Patterson stopped pacing and fixed Marcus with a stare that held years of accumulated hatred. Cowardice. Pure and simple. Garrison was drunk the night before the mission, hungover and sloppy when it mattered most. That dog of his was sick, some kind of stomach bug that affected his scent detection. But did Garrison report it? Did he request replacement personnel? Did he put the mission and his men's lives above his own career advancement? Marcus kept his voice level, though every instinct screamed danger. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. A truth buried under military politics and the kind of brotherhood code that protects the guilty. Patterson pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be official documents. Garrison received a letter of reprimand, a slap on the wrist for getting my son killed. Meanwhile, I got a folded flag and condolences from generals who knew exactly what had happened. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Marcus's wall clock. Outside, Ranger remained at his post, a faithful sentinel in the darkness. Marcus chose his words carefully. Even if that were true, the family disappeared 3 years ago. Whatever happened in Iraq was justice delayed, not justice denied. Patterson's mask slipped completely, revealing the obsessed, grieving father underneath. I spent 5 years planning, Mr. Thompson, 5 years researching Garrison's new life, his precious family, his comfortable retirement from the consequences of his actions. Marcus felt ice forming in his veins. What did you do? I gave him a choice. The same choice he gave my son. Patterson moved toward the window, looking out at the Garrison house. Live with the consequences of his failures, or watch his family suffer for them. Jesus Christ. You took them. I offered them an opportunity to understand loss, to comprehend what it means when someone you love dies because of another person's negligence. Patterson's voice took on an almost religious fervor. For 3 years, David Garrison has lived with the knowledge that his wife and son are paying for his sins, just like I've lived with the knowledge that my boy died for his. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his waistband, but Patterson noticed the movement and smiled coldly. I wouldn't if I were you. Rebecca and Tyler's continued well-being depends on your cooperation. Patterson pulled out his own weapon, a military-issue pistol that he handled with professional competence. They're alive, Mr. Thompson, but their situation is precarious. Where are they? Close enough that I can reach them quickly if needed, far enough away that stumbling across them would be nearly impossible. Patterson gestured toward the couch. Please, sit down. We have more to discuss. Marcus remained standing. Such as? Your investigation, your growing attachment to that animal across the street, your conversations with Mrs. Whitman about things that are none of your concern. Patterson's tone became conversational again, but the gun remained steady in his hand. You're a good soldier, Marcus. I've done my research. Decorated mechanic, served with honor, lost his wife to cancer. The kind of man who understands duty and sacrifice. I understand right from wrong. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're interfering with a military tribunal that's been 3 years in the making. Patterson moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. David Garrison is learning what my son learned. That actions have consequences. That failure can be fatal. That sometimes good people die because of other people's mistakes. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. And his family? What did they do to deserve this? They loved him, just like I loved Michael. Patterson's expression showed no remorse, only the cold satisfaction of a man who believed his cause was just. Rebecca Garrison spent 2 years watching her husband drink himself into depression, watching him fail at civilian jobs, watching him disappoint his son with promises he couldn't keep. She deserved to understand what real disappointment feels like. She's dead, isn't she? Patterson's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of genuine regret. Rebecca was fragile, weaker than I'd anticipated. The isolation, the stress, the knowledge that her husband's failures had condemned her family. It broke something inside her. She developed pneumonia last winter, without proper medical care. You let her die. I gave her the same medical attention my son received in that Iraqi desert. None. Patterson holstered his weapon, apparently confident that Marcus wouldn't try anything. David was forced to watch, just like I was forced to watch my boy's coffin come home. Marcus felt sick. The scope of Patterson's revenge was beyond anything he'd imagined. Systematic, calculated, and utterly without mercy. What about Tyler? The boy is resilient, traumatized, certainly, but children adapt. He'll have plenty of time to understand why his father's sins destroyed his family. Patterson checked his watch. Which brings me to your role in this, Mr. Thompson. I don't have a role in your sick game. On the contrary, you've inserted yourself into a situation that was carefully balanced. Your investigation threatens to upset 3 years of careful justice. Patterson walked to the window again, looking out at Ranger. That dog has been my most effective torture device. Every day, David sees him through the window of his cell, keeping faith that will never be rewarded. Oh, it's beautiful in its way. The loyalty of an animal highlighting the betrayal of the man. Marcus followed Patterson's gaze to Ranger, still sitting motionless in the darkness. The dog's dedication suddenly took on a horrific new dimension. Not just loyalty, but unwitting participation in his handler's psychological torture. You're insane. I'm thorough. Patterson turned back to Marcus, his expression businesslike. Which is why I'm giving you a choice, soldier to soldier. Walk away from this investigation, stop feeding that dog, convince Mrs. Whitman to mind her own business, and David and Tyler continue their education in consequence and loss. Keep interfering. And? Patterson's smile returned, cold and final. And you'll discover that some lessons require permanent enrollment. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that he was looking at a man who had crossed so far over the line between justice and revenge that he could no longer see it in his rearview mirror. Patterson wasn't just dangerous, he was completely unmoored from reality, living in a world where torture was justice and murder was education. I need time to think, Marcus said carefully. Of course. Take all the time you need." Patterson moved toward the door, his demeanor casual again. "But remember, time is a luxury that the Garrison family doesn't have much of. David's health has been declining recently. The stress of watching his son grow up in captivity, of knowing his wife died because of his failures, it takes a toll on a man." Patterson paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Oh, and Mr. Thompson, that dog across the street? He's been useful, but his purpose is nearly served. It would be a shame if something happened to him before David's education is complete." "A terrible shame, but sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." The door closed behind Patterson with a soft click, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of an impossible choice and the certain knowledge that Ranger, David, and Tyler Garrison were living on borrowed time. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in his darkened living room, watching Ranger's silhouette through the window while his mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. Patterson's threat hung over him like a loaded weapon, but the alternative, abandoning the Garrison family to their tormentor, was unthinkable. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The first call went to his daughter Jessica in Seattle. Her voice, sleepy and concerned, cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a lifeline. "Dad? It's 5 in the morning. Are you okay?" Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing Patterson might be listening. "I need you to come home, Jess. It's important, and I can't explain over the phone." "Is it your health? Are you sick?" The panic in Jessica's voice reminded him of the scared little girl she'd once been, calling for him during thunderstorms. "I'm fine, but I need my daughter." "Can you get time off work?" The silence stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. When Jessica spoke again, her voice carried the same determination that had gotten her through law school and built her successful practice. "I'll be on a flight tonight. Dad, you're scaring me." "Good. Stay scared until you get here and don't tell anyone you're coming." The second call was harder. Marcus dialed Eleanor's number, knowing she'd be up with the sunrise, tending her roses with the devotion of a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and needed something beautiful to nurture. "Eleanor, it's Marcus. We need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you come over for coffee in an hour?" "Of course, honey. You sound terrible. Didn't you sleep?" "Not much, Eleanor. Bring your photo albums, the ones from when the Garrisons lived here." When Eleanor arrived, she carried a shoebox filled with memories and a pot of fresh coffee that smelled like salvation. Her face was drawn with worry, the kind of expression that came from surviving enough tragedy to recognize its approach. "Marcus, you're frightening me. What happened after I left last night?" He told her everything, watching her face pale as the full scope of Patterson's revenge became clear. When he finished, Eleanor set down her coffee cup with shaking hands and stared out at Ranger, who remained at his faithful post. "That poor creature," she whispered. "All this time, he's been part of that monster's torture." "Eleanor, I need to ask something terrible of you. Patterson's watching us, and if we're going to save that family, we need him to believe we're backing down." Marcus pulled out his phone, showing her the number he'd already programmed. "This goes directly to the FBI field office in Charlotte. If something happens to me, if I disappear or turn up dead, you call this number and tell them everything." "Marcus, no." "You can't go after him alone." "I'm not going alone." Marcus looked out at Ranger. "That dog has been waiting 3 years for someone to follow him home. I think it's time." Eleanor spent the morning helping Marcus prepare, her organizational skills and decades of military wife experience proving invaluable. They developed a simple communication system. If Marcus didn't call by 6 p.m., Eleanor would contact the FBI. If Patterson appeared at her house, she would immediately dial 911 and tell them about the photos she'd hidden in her safety deposit box. "The pictures from that night," she explained, pulling them from the shoebox with trembling fingers. Frank did take them after all, the old fool. He was too scared to show them to police, but he couldn't stop himself from documenting what he saw. The photographs were grainy, taken through their bedroom window with an old digital camera, but they clearly showed two figures dragging something heavy from the Garrison house to a dark van. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., August 15th, the night the family disappeared. Frank was always paranoid about having evidence, Eleanor said. Spent his Navy years documenting everything, said it was the only way to protect yourself from superior officers who'd throw you under the bus. Her voice broke. He made me promise never to show these to anyone. Said it would get us both killed. Marcus studied the photos carefully. One figure was clearly Patterson, his military bearing unmistakable even in the darkness. The other was smaller, younger, possibly a hired accomplice or another soldier under Patterson's command. But it was the third photograph that made Marcus's blood run cold. Ranger was in the picture, lying motionless near the van. Even in the poor lighting, Marcus could see the dark stains around the dog, blood that told the story of a faithful companion who'd fought desperately to protect his family and lost. Jesus, Eleanor. Patterson didn't just take the family. He nearly killed Ranger that night. The poor thing showed up 3 days later, more dead than alive. I think he crawled away somewhere to heal, then came back to wait for them. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. He's been doing penance for 3 years, Marcus, blaming himself for not being strong enough to save them. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Marcus prepared for what might be his final mission. He cleaned his service weapon, loaded extra magazines, and wrote letters to Jessica that he hoped she'd never have to read. The hardest part was watching Ranger through the window, knowing that the dog's vigil was about to end, one way or another. At 4 o'clock, Marcus made his move. He walked across the street with a bowl of fresh water and a plate of food, settling on the ground beside Ranger with the patience of a man who understood military discipline. "Hey there, soldier," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that any surveillance devices wouldn't pick it up. "I know you've been waiting for orders. I think it's time we went to find David." Ranger's ears pricked up at his handler's name, and for the first time in days, the dog turned his head to look directly at Marcus. Those amber eyes held intelligence, grief, and something that might have been hope. "I can't promise we'll bring them home," Marcus continued, carefully removing a small GPS tracker from his pocket, a device Jessica had sent him for hiking that he'd never used. "But I can promise you won't wait alone anymore." He attached the tracker to Ranger's collar, hidden beneath the thick fur where Patterson wouldn't notice it. The dog submitted to the handling with the patience of a creature accustomed to military equipment. "Now, here's what we're going to do. You're going to show me where they are, and I'm going to do everything in my power to bring your family home." Marcus looked directly into Ranger's eyes, speaking with the authority of a commanding officer. "But you need to understand something, boy. This might be a one-way mission. Are you ready for that?" Ranger's tail moved slightly, not a wag, but an acknowledgement. The dog understood duty, sacrifice, and the price of loyalty. He'd been paying that price for 3 years. As evening approached, Marcus called Eleanor one last time. "If you don't hear from me by morning, you know what to do. Marcus, please, let the FBI handle this." "The FBI will find bodies, Eleanor. Patterson's too smart to leave evidence and too broken to show mercy. By the time federal agents get involved, David and Tyler will be dead." Marcus looked out at Ranger, who had risen to his feet as if sensing the approaching mission. "That dog has been keeping faith for 3 years. The least I can do is honor it." At 8 p.m., as darkness settled over Pinewood like a funeral shroud, Marcus stepped out of his house wearing dark clothing and carrying a backpack filled with everything he might need for a night operation. Ranger was waiting for him, no longer sitting but standing at attention, every line of his body radiating purpose. "All right, boy," Marcus whispered. Take me to them." Ranger looked at him once, as if confirming the order, then turned and began walking toward the edge of town. His gait was steady but careful, the movement of an old soldier whose body remembered training even after years of waiting. Marcus followed, his own military instincts awakening after years of civilian dormancy. They walked through neighborhoods where families were settling in for evening television and homework, past streetlights that marked the boundary between safety and whatever lay beyond. Ranger moved with purpose, following a path that existed only in his memory and his heart. As they reached the outskirts of Pinewood, where civilization gave way to the pine forests that had given the town its name, Marcus felt the familiar weight of impending combat settling over him. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a broken family was waiting for rescue that might never come. Behind them, Eleanor Whitman sat in her kitchen with a loaded shotgun and a phone, keeping her own vigil while two soldiers, one human, one canine, disappeared into the night on a mission that would either bring the Garrison family home or add 2 more names to Patterson's list of casualties. The path through the pine forest felt familiar beneath Marcus's boots, awakening muscle memory from countless night patrols in Afghanistan. Ranger moved ahead with the quiet confidence of a dog who'd walked this route many times, his paws finding the silent spaces between dried leaves and fallen branches. The canopy above blocked most of the starlight, creating a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. After 2 miles of steady hiking, Ranger stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned logging road. The dog's body language changed, becoming more alert, more cautious. Marcus understood. They were entering hostile territory now. He pulled out his phone, noting the GPS coordinates and sending them to the encrypted message he'd prepared for Eleanor, set to transmit automatically if he didn't cancel it by midnight. The logging road led deeper into the forest, winding toward what Marcus's military maps had shown as the old Fort Bragg Auxiliary Training Grounds. Abandoned since the base restructuring in 2010, the area was perfect for someone who needed absolute isolation and had the resources to maintain it secretly. Patterson had chosen his prison well. Ranger paused again, this time beside a tree that bore subtle markings, small cuts in the bark that formed an arrow pointing north. Marcus recognized the signs as military trail markers, the kind used in covert operations. Patterson wasn't just hiding his captives. He was maintaining an operational facility. They followed the markers for another half-mile until Ranger suddenly froze, his body going rigid with tension. Through the trees ahead, Marcus could see the faint glow of artificial light. They'd found it. The compound was larger than Marcus had expected. What looked like an old military bunker had been expanded with additional structures, all carefully camouflaged beneath the forest canopy. Solar panels glinted on rooftops, and Marcus could hear the quiet hum of generators. This wasn't a makeshift prison. It was a permanent installation that had taken years to build. Ranger led him to a concealed observation point overlooking the compound. From here, Marcus could see the full scope of Patterson's operation, guard towers that appeared unmanned but likely contained motion sensors, a main building that looked like converted barracks, smaller structures that could be storage or specialized facilities, and at the center, a concrete blockhouse with barred windows that could only be a prison. Marcus spent 20 minutes observing, using his military training to identify patterns and weaknesses. Patterson had built this place with professional competence, overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes, redundant security systems. But he'd also built it as a one-man operation, and that was its weakness. The first sign of life came at 10:30. A figure emerged from the main building, moving with Patterson's distinctive military bearing. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the rifle slung across his shoulder and the tactical vest that suggested he was prepared for trouble. Patterson walked a perimeter check that lasted exactly 15 minutes, then disappeared back inside the building. "Professional habits," Marcus whispered to Ranger. "He can't help himself." Ranger's attention was fixed on the concrete blockhouse. The dog's entire body trembled with restraint, every instinct screaming at him to rush toward the building where his family was imprisoned. Marcus understood that desperation. It was the same feeling that had driven him through 2 tours of duty and countless missions. At 11 o'clock, Patterson emerged again, this time carrying a tray of food toward the blockhouse. Marcus watched through the scope of his rifle as the door opened briefly, revealing a glimpse of a figure inside, thin, bearded, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd been confined too long. David Garrison was alive. But it was what happened next that nearly broke Marcus's composure. A child appeared in the doorway. Tyler Garrison, now 13 but small for his age, his face bearing the hollow expression of prolonged trauma. The boy said something to Patterson, who responded by striking him across the face hard enough to knock him backward into the darkness of the cell. Ranger made a low sound in his throat, somewhere between a whimper and a growl. Marcus placed a restraining hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the animal's entire body coiled like a spring, ready to release. "Not yet, boy. We do this right, or we don't do it at all." Patterson's routine continued for another hour. A second perimeter check, maintenance on the generators, and what appeared to be radio communications with someone outside the compound. Marcus used the time to plan his approach, identifying the best routes and timing windows. The breakthrough came when Patterson made a mistake born of 3 years of unchallenged routine. During his midnight perimeter check, he left the door to the main building unlocked, just for 15 minutes, but enough for someone with military training to exploit. Marcus made his move with the silent efficiency of a professional soldier. While Patterson completed his circuit of the compound's outer edge, Marcus and Ranger approached the main building from the blind spot created by the generator housing. The door was exactly where he'd observed it, and it opened silently on well-maintained hinges. Inside, the building confirmed Marcus's worst fears. What had once been military barracks had been converted into a command center for psychological warfare. The walls were covered with photographs, pictures of the Garrison family taken during their captivity, documenting their deterioration over 3 years. David's transformation from confident soldier to broken prisoner. Rebecca's decline from vibrant mother to gaunt ghost, ending with what were clearly death photos. Tyler's gradual loss of childhood, his face aging years in the span of months. But it was the detailed charts and schedules that revealed the true depth of Patterson's madness. He'd documented every aspect of the family's suffering with military precision. Meal schedules designed to maintain malnutrition without causing death. Exercise regimens intended to prevent escape attempts. Psychological manipulation techniques refined through years of practice. A logbook on Patterson's desk contained entries that read like a mission report written by a psychopath. Day 1127. Subject: David showed increased emotional response to child's distress. Recommended increasing separation periods to maximize psychological impact. Day 1203. Rebecca's condition deteriorating rapidly. Medical intervention contraindicated. Natural consequences preferred. The final entry, dated just 2 days ago, made Marcus's blood run cold. Phase 3. Preparation complete. Subjects David and Tyler ready for final lesson. Disposal protocols activated. Ranger had found something else. A tactical map showing the compound's layout, with the blockhouse marked as primary containment and a smaller building marked as processing facility. Red X's marked locations labeled Disposal Site A and Disposal Site B. Patterson wasn't just torturing the Garrison family anymore. He was preparing to kill them. Marcus had no time to process the full horror of what he'd discovered. Patterson's footsteps were already approaching the building, the measured cadence of a man who'd walked this route thousands of times. Marcus grabbed the tactical map and logbook, stuffing them into his backpack as he and Ranger slipped out the back door, just as Patterson's key turned in the front lock. They made it to the tree line as lights came on throughout the compound. Patterson had noticed something, a chair slightly out of position perhaps, or the smell of an intruder that Ranger's presence couldn't mask. Marcus heard shouting, then the mechanical sound of weapons being armed. "Lockdown protocol!" Patterson's voice carried across the compound with military authority. "All systems active." Floodlights blazed to life, turning the forest clearing into a stark tableau of light and shadow. Motion sensors activated, sweeping the perimeter with mechanical precision. Marcus realized with growing dread that what he'd taken for an abandoned facility was actually a sophisticated military installation that Patterson could control from a central command. But the lights revealed something else. Tyler Garrison's face at the barred window of the blockhouse, pressed against the glass with the desperate hope of a child who'd heard sounds of possible rescue. The boy's mouth moved silently, forming words Marcus couldn't hear but could understand. "Help us." Ranger saw his family too. The dog's entire body went rigid, then began to vibrate with barely controlled energy. 3 years of faithful waiting had led to this moment, and every instinct demanded that he rush to them immediately. Only Marcus's firm hand on his collar prevented the dog from breaking cover. "I know, boy," Marcus whispered, "but we do this smart, or they die." Patterson emerged from the main building carrying military-grade weapons and wearing full tactical gear. This wasn't the polite neighbor who'd sat in Marcus's living room. This was a special operations soldier ready for war. He moved with deadly purpose toward the blockhouse, and Marcus realized with horror that Patterson intended to execute his prisoners rather than risk their rescue. "David!" Patterson's voice boomed across the compound. "I know you can hear me. Your friend Thompson decided to play hero, and now your boy pays the price." The sound of Tyler's screaming cut through the night air like a knife. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, the same feeling he'd had watching his unit take casualties in Afghanistan, the helpless rage of a soldier who couldn't save everyone he'd sworn to protect. But Ranger had reached his breaking point. The German shepherd tore free from Marcus's grip and launched himself toward the compound with the speed and fury of a military working dog whose handler was in danger. 3 years of patient waiting exploded into motion as Ranger crossed the open ground in seconds, his powerful legs carrying him past motion sensors and floodlights toward the family he'd never stopped protecting. Patterson spun toward the sound, raising his rifle toward the charging dog. Marcus didn't think. He acted on pure instinct, raising his own weapon and firing. The bullet caught Patterson in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle skittering across the concrete. "Federal agents!" Marcus shouted, hoping his bluff would buy precious seconds. "Drop your weapons!" Patterson laughed, a sound devoid of sanity or hope. Blood streamed down his arm, but he pulled a sidearm with his good hand. "There are no federal agents, Thompson. Just you, me, and 3 years of unfinished business." Ranger reached the blockhouse and began clawing frantically at the door, his nails scraping against steel as he tried to reach his family. David Garrison appeared at the window, his face a mask of disbelief as he saw his faithful partner for the first time in 3 years. "Ranger?" David's voice was broken, barely recognizable as the confident soldier from Marcus's research. "Oh God, Ranger, I thought you were dead." The dog's response was a howl of pure anguish. 3 years of grief, guilt, and unwavering loyalty poured into a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. It was the cry of a creature who had kept faith when faith seemed impossible, who had waited when waiting was torture, who had never stopped believing that love could overcome any obstacle. Patterson aimed his pistol at Ranger, his face twisted with rage. "That animal has been my greatest success, Thompson. 3 years of psychological warfare, and that damn dog never stopped hoping, but hope dies hard, doesn't it?" Marcus moved without conscious thought, placing himself between Patterson's gun and the dog. "Your son wouldn't want this, Bill. Michael was a soldier, not a murderer. Don't you dare speak his name." Patterson's control finally shattered completely. "You didn't know my boy. You didn't watch him die because some coward couldn't do his job. You're right, I didn't know Michael. But I know soldiers, and I know what he'd think of what you've become." Marcus kept his rifle trained on Patterson while moving slowly toward the blockhouse. "He'd be ashamed of you." Patterson's face went white with fury. "Ashamed? I honored my son's memory. I made the man responsible understand loss. You made a family suffer for your pain. That's not honor. That's cowardice." The accusation hit Patterson like a physical blow. His weapon wavered as tears began streaming down his face. "I loved my boy. He was everything good in this world, and Garrison's negligence killed him. Then let his death mean something. Let this family go home. Let your son's memory be about the good man he was, not the monster his father became." For a moment, Marcus thought he'd reached something human in Patterson's broken psyche. The older man's weapon lowered slightly, his face showing confusion and grief instead of rage. Then Tyler's voice cut through the night. "Ranger! You came back! You came back for us!" The sound of the child's joy shattered whatever sanity remained in Patterson's mind. His weapon snapped up, aimed directly at the boy visible in the window. "If I can't have my son, Garrison can't have his." Marcus fired without hesitation. The bullet took Patterson's center mass, dropping him to the concrete where he lay gasping, his weapon fallen from nerveless fingers. Blood pooled beneath him as his life ebbed away with each labored breath. Patterson's final words were whispered to the night sky. "I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Marcus kicked away Patterson's weapons and rushed to the blockhouse. The door was secured with military-grade locks, but Patterson's key ring was still clipped to his belt. Marcus's hands shook as he tried key after key. Ranger pressed against his legs, whimpering with anticipation. The lock clicked open, and Marcus pulled the heavy door wide. David Garrison stumbled out first, a broken man whose eyes held the hollow stare of someone who'd survived hell. He was thin to the point of emaciation, his hair gone gray, his movements careful and painful. But when he saw Ranger, something sparked to life in those dead eyes. "My boy," David whispered, falling to his knees as Ranger launched himself into his arms. "My good boy, you waited for me." The reunion was heartbreaking in its intensity. Ranger covered David's face with desperate kisses while the man sobbed into his dog's fur, 3 years of separation and suffering pouring out in broken words of love and gratitude. For a moment, the horror of their situation was forgotten in the pure joy of a bond that had survived torture, time, and seemingly impossible odds. Tyler emerged next, moving with the cautious steps of a child who'd learned that the world was full of pain and betrayal. But when he saw Ranger, the walls came down. The 13-year-old boy collapsed beside his father and his dog, crying with the raw emotion of someone who'd held back tears for far too long. "I knew you'd come back," Tyler sobbed into Ranger's fur. "I knew you wouldn't leave us forever." Marcus stepped back, giving the family space for their reunion while pulling out his phone to call Eleanor. The nightmare was over, but the healing was just beginning. As he watched the broken family cling to each other and their faithful dog, Marcus felt tears streaming down his own face. Sometimes he realized love really was stronger than death, more powerful than torture, more enduring than time itself. And sometimes it came with 4 legs and a heart that refused to give up hope. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in his backyard watching Tyler Garrison throw a tennis ball for Ranger, whose tail wagged with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd rediscovered joy. The German Shepherd moved more slowly now. Age and old injuries had taken their toll, but his eyes held the bright contentment of an animal surrounded by the family he'd never stopped protecting. The healing hadn't been easy or quick. David Garrison spent 2 months in the Veterans Affairs Hospital, slowly recovering from 3 years of systematic malnutrition and psychological torture. The doctors said his physical wounds would heal, but the mental scars might never fully fade. David rarely spoke about his captivity, but sometimes Marcus would find him sitting quietly with Ranger, the two of them sharing the kind of communication that didn't require words. Tyler's recovery was complicated by the normal challenges of adolescence layered over profound trauma. At 14, he was small for his age and struggled with nightmares, panic attacks, and a distrust of authority figures that made school difficult. But Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who'd helped nurse Ranger back to health, had recommended a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, and slowly, Tyler was learning to be a child again. "He's getting better," Eleanor Whitman said, joining Marcus on the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. At 76, she'd become the unofficial grandmother to the reconstituted Garrison family, providing the kind of steady, unconditional love that helped heal wounds no doctor could treat. "Yesterday I caught him laughing at something on television. First time I've heard that boy really laugh since—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all measured time now in terms of before Patterson and after. The investigation into Colonel Patterson's crimes had revealed a network of corruption and cover-ups that stretched back years. 3 other military families had been found dead in similar compounds, their disappearances explained away as transfers or family emergencies. Patterson's personal war against perceived injustice had claimed dozens of lives before Marcus and Ranger stopped it. Jessica had flown back from Seattle immediately after the rescue, her legal expertise invaluable in navigating the complex federal investigation that followed. She'd taken a leave of absence from her firm to help David and Tyler access the services they needed, but Marcus suspected her extended stay had more to do with Dr. Chen than with legal proceedings. His daughter had found something in Pinewood that her high-powered Seattle life had been missing. "Dad," Jessica called from the kitchen window. "David's on the phone. He wants to know if you and Ranger want to come to the memorial service next week." The memorial service. Marcus had been dreading and anticipating it in equal measure. The Army had finally acknowledged what Patterson had done, and they were honoring the memory of Michael Patterson, the son, not the sins of the father. David had requested that he and Marcus speak about the young soldier who died trying to save his unit, separate from the twisted legacy his father had created. "Tell him yes," Marcus replied. It was time to close that chapter of the story. That evening, as the sun set over Pinewood, Marcus found himself walking the familiar path to the small cemetery where they'd buried Rebecca Garrison with full military honors. Her headstone read simply, "Rebecca Ann Garrison, beloved wife and mother, 1985-2021. Below that, in smaller letters, "She kept faith until the end." David and Tyler were already there, sitting quietly beside the grave with Ranger lying between them. The dog's muzzle had gone gray in the months since the rescue, and he slept more than he used to, but his devotion to his family remained absolute. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," David said quietly as Marcus approached. His voice was stronger now, though it still carried the weight of what he'd endured. "Rebecca used to say that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die." Tyler looked up from where he'd been arranging fresh flowers on his mother's grave. "Do you forgive him?" Colonel Patterson, I mean. It was a question they'd all wrestled with. Patterson had been a grieving father whose pain had twisted into something monstrous, but he'd also been a torturer and murderer who'd destroyed innocent lives. The line between justice and vengeance, between grief and evil, wasn't as clear as Marcus had once believed. "I forgive the father who lost his son," David said carefully. "I can't forgive the man who took mine away from his mother for 3 years." He reached down to scratch Ranger's ears. "But I can try to understand how grief can make people do terrible things." Tyler nodded solemnly, older than his years in the way that trauma survivors often were. "Mom would want us to forgive him. She always said that hatred hurt the person carrying it more than the person it was aimed at." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Rebecca Garrison had died believing her family might never be rescued, had spent her final months watching her husband and son suffer because of one man's twisted need for revenge. Yet, according to David, her final words had been about love and forgiveness, not anger or despair. "Your mother was a wise woman," Marcus said, "and a brave one." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the cemetery. Ranger lifted his head occasionally as if listening for sounds only he could hear, but he remained calm and content. The hypervigilance that had marked his years of waiting was gone, replaced by the peaceful alertness of a dog who knew his family was safe. "I have something for you," David said, pulling a small wooden carving from his pocket. It was rough but recognizable, a German shepherd in a sitting position, carved with the careful attention of someone who'd had nothing but time and memory to guide their hands. "I made this for you during the last year. It's supposed to be Ranger." Marcus accepted the carving with hands that weren't quite steady. The wood was smooth from handling, and he could see where David had worked on details during countless hours of captivity. It was more than a gift. It was a testament to hope, to the faith that had kept a father believing he might someday give his creation to someone who would understand its meaning. "It's beautiful," Marcus said, and meant it. "Thank you." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Pinewood, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a broken-down widower, looking for nothing more than peace and quiet. Now he was part of something that felt like family. Not the family he'd been born into or married into, but the family forged by shared trauma, mutual rescue, and the kind of love that transcended blood relations. Eleanor was waiting on her porch when they passed, as she did every evening, ready with fresh cookies and the kind of gossip that made small towns feel like home. Dr. Chen's truck was parked in Marcus's driveway, and through his kitchen window he could see her and Jessica preparing dinner with the easy familiarity of women who'd found something worth building together. "You know," Tyler said, walking beside Marcus while Ranger trotted happily between them, "I used to have nightmares about that place, about Colonel Patterson and what he did to us. But lately I dream about Ranger instead, about how he never gave up looking for us even when everyone else thought we were gone." "He's a good dog," Marcus said simply. "The best," Tyler agreed. "Mom used to say that dogs were angels in disguise, sent to teach us about unconditional love. I didn't really understand what she meant until—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened. "Until I realized Ranger had been keeping vigil for us all along." They reached Marcus's house where the warm glow of lights and the sound of laughter promised the kind of evening that had become precious in its ordinariness. Jessica appeared at the door, her face bright with the happiness of someone who'd found her place in the world. "Dinner's ready," she called, "and Sarah brought dessert." As they climbed the porch steps, Ranger paused to look back toward the Garrison house, which now showed signs of renovation and new life. David and Tyler had decided to move back in, to reclaim the home that Patterson had tried to turn into a symbol of loss and failure. It was a brave choice, but then courage seemed to run in the Garrison family. a courage that extended to a faithful dog who'd kept watch over an empty house for 3 years. "Come on, boy," Marcus said gently. "Time to go home." Ranger looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, tail wagging slowly but steadily. Then he trotted up the steps and through the door, following his extended family into the warmth and light of a house filled with the kind of love that had made his long vigil worthwhile. Marcus paused in the doorway, David's carving warm in his hand, and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other families were struggling with loss, trauma, and the long road to healing. But here in Pinewood, North Carolina, love had proven stronger than hatred, loyalty had triumphed over revenge, and a faithful dog had taught them all about the power of never giving up hope. Sometimes, Marcus thought as he closed the door behind him, the best rescues were the ones where everyone saved everyone else. Dear friends, Marcus Thompson's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest purpose comes not in our youth, but in the wisdom of our later years. At 62, when others might have chosen isolation, Marcus found the courage to answer a faithful dog's call for help. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, loss of spouses, estranged children, financial worries, the quiet ache of feeling forgotten, Marcus discovered that our scars don't disqualify us from heroism, they prepare us for it. Ranger's 3-year vigil speaks to every heart that has waited, hoped, and refused to give up on love. This isn't just a story about rescuing others. It's about how, in our 50s and 60s, we still have the power to write the most meaningful chapters of our lives. Whether you're a veteran carrying invisible wounds, a widow learning to live alone, or a parent whose children have grown distant, remember, your faithfulness matters. Your experience has value, and sometimes the family that needs you most isn't the one you were born into, but the one you choose to protect. Age doesn't diminish our capacity for courage, it refines it into something pure and purposeful. Questions for you. Have you ever felt like Ranger, faithfully waiting for someone or something that seemed lost forever? What gave you the strength to keep hope alive during your darkest moments? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.